Okay, let's unpack this. We've got some really interesting sources here, things like legislative analyses, even internal policy briefs. They detail this incredibly complex journey of a major tax bill through the Senate. So our deep dive today, it's all about understanding the key legislative hurdles, the roadblocks this bill hit, and the surprising impacts these fights could have on you, plus what these intense negotiations really well meant for getting it passed.
Yeah, and what jumped out immediately from our sources was how concerns about long-term fiscal health just became this central blocking point, almost immovable. The initial projections showed adding trillions to the national debt. Our sources confirmed this wasn't just like a background number. It became the main lever for fiscal conservatives. They basically pulled it to try and stop the bill, demanding real solutions.
That's fascinating. So trillions in debt, a huge concern. And to tackle that, this trigger mechanism was proposed. The idea was, automatic tax hikes if growth targets weren't met. Simple enough, right? But here's where our sources show it got really tricky. This trigger, meant to calm fears, actually became a massive fight itself. What specifically did the documents reveal? What was the snag that made it such a political landmine?
Well, the concept, yeah, it seems sound. But the legislative notes, the analyses we looked at, they show the devil was totally in the details. Certain factions, according to our research, they argued the metrics for the trigger were just flawed. Like, should it be tied to GDP growth? Or maybe unemployment rates. Economists actually raised red flags. They worried these specific triggers could sort of accidentally force tax hikes during an economic downturn, making a bad situation worse, not just when growth was kind of sluggish. So that made it a non-starter for key swing votes. They worried about unintended consequences, even within their own party.
Wow. So a solution meant for stability created its own set of economic anxieties. Makes
Why?
sense. And that ripple effect idea, it really plays out in the next big hurdle, too, because just as they were wrestling with that trigger, the sources show the bill suddenly swerved into a completely different policy minefield, healthcare.
Exactly. Including the repeal of the Obamacare individual mandate right in the tax bill. That was a total game changer. Our sources are really clear on this. For many senators, this wasn't just about access to health care, no. It was a bigger ideological fight. Opponents saw putting the mandate repeal in a tax bill as like a backdoor attempt to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. It just reignited the whole Obamacare debate all over again. And that made finding common ground on tax reform almost impossible for some people.
That's a huge strategic shift, isn't it? A real pivot. Our deep dive showed it created this kind of poison pill dynamic. How did that complicate things? Even just the basic negotiations for the tax part of the bill.
Oh, it made passing it incredibly difficult because for some senators, voting for the tax bill now meant they were also voting for the ACA repeal. And that was just politically impossible back in their home states. Our sources even point to senators who might have otherwise supported the tax changes, but they had to back off because the mandate repeal was included. It just shows how deeply tangled these policy areas became. It forced really tough choices, often mutually exclusive ones.
Right. And then, as if that wasn't enough, our deep dive uncovered this really intense localized fight, but with national impact. I'm talking about the state and local tax deduction, SALT. What did the sources tell us about the regional splits there?
Yeah, SALT was, well, deeply regional,
Hmm.
but with very direct, very measurable impacts on people's wallets. High-tax states, think New York, California, New Jersey, their residents were hit hard by the proposed changes.
Hmm.
Our notes highlighted projections showing thousands of dollars in extra taxes for some families in those areas. It became a real kitchen table issue.
So it turned into protecting specific constituents, protecting their own voters.
Yeah.
Does the sources mention any specific compromises or attempts to fix the SALT issue? Or was it just an unyielding roadblock?
Oh, absolutely. The sources recount some really passionate arguments from senators in those high-tax states. They basically vowed to block any bill that didn't fully restore the SALT deduction.
Yeah.
This created a solid block of opposition. It forced negotiators into a corner, either drop the SALT change entirely or lose critical votes. And these weren't just party line splits, they were regional too. It became clear that compromising on SALT meant facing serious political heat back home. It was almost impossible to bridge that gap.
Okay, so just to quickly recap what our deep dive showed us.
Yeah.
This tax bill faced enormous hurdles. There were those intense worries about the national debt, that whole controversial trigger mechanism, then the unexpected, politically explosive link to health care with the individual mandate repeal, and finally, the direct, very divisive impact of the changes to the state and local tax, the SALT deduction.
Right. So what does this all mean for you? Well, these aren't just, abstract political arguments happening far away. Our sources really underline how these debates touch on everything, from your potential healthcare costs to your property taxes and, yeah, even that huge national debt we all share.
Which really raises an important question, something for you to think about. When major laws like this are being made, how do we balance the understandable desire for quick action with the absolute need for thorough consideration? Thinking through every single potential long-term impact, every nuance, especially when really complex policy areas like taxes and healthcare suddenly get tangled up together like this.